The Curse That Follows, Uncovering the Dark Secrets of a Village's Eternal Nightmare. Chapter 1, The Invitation. Ethan Miller sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the dull hum of the city outside barely registering in his mind. He was, as usual, scrolling through forums about the paranormal. His fascination with the unexplained had always set him apart. UFO sightings, ghost encounters, ancient curses. Ethan thrived on the stories others dismissed as superstition. But tonight, something peculiar caught his attention. His phone buzzed softly on the table, a notification interrupting his thoughts. Frowning, Ethan reached for it. The message was from an unknown number. "Come visit us. A once-in-a-lifetime experience awaits you in the Village of the Forgotten." There was no link, no name, just those cryptic words. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, the thrill of the unknown prickling his skin. The Village of the Forgotten? He had never heard of such a place, and a quick search on his phone revealed nothing. No coordinates, no historical references, not even a whisper of it in any of his usual paranormal hangouts. His fingers hovered over the screen, torn between curiosity and common sense. But Ethan had never been one to let common sense get in the way of a good mystery. The next day, Ethan sat across from his best friend Samantha in their usual cafe. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the steaming mugs between them. Sam's brows knitted together as she stared at Ethan, clearly unconvinced. "You want us to go where?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Just hear me out," Ethan said, leaning forward. "It's an adventure. Think about it, Sam. A village no one's heard of, an invitation from who knows where. Doesn't that intrigue you even a little?" Sam crossed her arms, glancing out the window before returning her gaze to him. "A random message from an unknown number asking us to visit some village that doesn't exist on any map. Ethan, that sounds like a bad horror movie." "Exactly." Ethan grinned, knowing she couldn't resist a challenge. "It's perfect. We've been talking about doing something different for a while now. What if this is it? What if we stumble onto something incredible?" She sighed, shaking her head, but there was a glint in her eye that Ethan recognized. Sam had always been the rational one, but deep down she loved the thrill of the unknown almost as much as he did. "So, who else is in on this brilliant plan?" Sam asked, still sounding half dismissive but more intrigued now. "I'm thinking Jake, maybe Chris and Lisa too," Ethan said, pulling out his phone. "Jake's always down for a weekend trip, and Chris and Lisa, well, they could use a break from the usual routine." "Jake, sure. But Chris and Lisa, they're gonna take some convincing." Ethan nodded. "Leave that to me. You know I can be persuasive." By the time Ethan had gathered everyone at his apartment later that evening, his excitement was palpable. Jake sprawled lazily on the couch, wearing his usual smirk, while Chris and Lisa sat side by side, sharing uncertain glances. Sam leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Ethan as he paced the room, phone in hand. "So here's the deal," Ethan began, eyes lighting up as he addressed the group. "I got this message yesterday, an invite to visit some place called the Village of the Forgotten. It's supposed to be an experience unlike any other. I've done some digging, and I couldn't find anything about this village online. No records, no coordinates, nothing. But that's what makes it interesting, right?" Jake snorted, pushing himself upright. "So what? You want us to follow some sketchy text into the middle of nowhere?" "Basically, yes," Ethan said, unfazed. "Think about it. When's the last time any of us did something genuinely spontaneous?" Chris looked skeptical, glancing at Lisa. "Sounds like a wild goose chase. What if we get there and it's just a dead end? Or worse, what if it's a trap?" "Relax, Chris," Jake chimed in. "Worst case, we get some fresh air, explore a new place. Best case, we stumble onto something cool. Besides, what's life without a little risk?" Ethan nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We'll be together, and we'll take precautions. But come on, guys, we're always saying we want to shake things up. This could be our shot." Lisa finally spoke up, her voice quieter than the others, but thoughtful. "I don't know. It feels weird. Like, what if we're not meant to find this village? If it's not on any map, doesn't that seem off to you?" Ethan smiled, sensing her uncertainty, but also the growing curiosity in the room. "That's what makes it worth going. It's something no one else has done. Don't you want to be a part of something mysterious, something real?" There was a brief pause before Sam sighed, pushing herself off the wall. "All right, fine. but I'm only doing this because I know if I don't, you'll get yourself into trouble, and I'll have to come save you anyway." Jake laughed, clapping his hands together. "That's the spirit?" Chris and Lisa exchanged another look before nodding reluctantly. "I guess we're in," Chris said. "Awesome." Ethan's grin widened as he checked the time. "We leave tomorrow morning. Pack light." That night, as Ethan prepared for the trip, a strange feeling settled over him. It wasn't fear exactly, but an odd sense of anticipation. He'd been on spontaneous road trips before, but this felt different. The air around him seemed charged with something unfamiliar, like static before a storm. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, another message from the same number, "Don't be late." Ethan frowned, sitting up. How could they know? The message felt more personal this time, as if someone or something was watching. He shook off the thought and tried to sleep, but his dreams were anything but peaceful. He dreamt of dark forests, of whispers carried on the wind, and of eyes, unblinking, hidden in the shadows, watching from the edges of his vision. When morning finally came, Ethan awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him out there, something ancient and hungry. But instead of dread, he felt a thrill race through him. This was exactly what he'd wanted, an adventure into the unknown. The next morning, the group gathered at the edge of town, their bags packed and spirits high. The early sunlight bathed everything in a warm glow, but Ethan could sense the underlying tension. Despite their banter, there was an unspoken unease hanging over them, like a shadow they couldn't shake. The road ahead stretched out into the horizon, but as they drove, the familiar landmarks began to disappear. The GPS flickered, then died. No signal, no maps, just the road and whatever lay beyond it. As they ventured deeper, the landscape shifted, trees grew denser, the sky darker, and the air heavier. Ethan's heart pounded with anticipation, the message still fresh in his mind. Don't be late. They were heading into the unknown, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 2. Off the Grid. The sky was overcast as the group piled into Jake's old SUV, the low hum of the engine filling the air. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his phone in hand, rechecking the message that had sparked their journey. A set of vague directions had followed after the initial invitation, leading them through rural roads and remote highways, with barely a mention of towns along the way. Ethan's stomach twisted in excitement and something else he couldn't quite place. He glanced back at his friends, their conversations masking a sense of underlying anxiety. Sam sat behind him, arms crossed, her brow furrowed as she stared out the window. Chris and Lisa, sitting beside her, spoke in low tones, while Jake focused on the road ahead, occasionally glancing at the map on the dashboard. The route stretched ahead, a straight line into nothingness, surrounded by vast fields that slowly transitioned into dense forests. "Everything still good with the directions, man?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," Ethan replied, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. The further they drove, the less confident he felt about what lay ahead. "Just keep going straight for now." The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees when they passed the last semblance of civilization, a lonely gas station with its sign flickering. Ethan glanced at his phone again, hoping for service. Still nothing. They were truly off the grid now, far from any place they had known. "Are you sure this village even exists?" Sam finally asked, her voice betraying her unease. "I mean, we haven't seen a single person or town for hours. It has to be out here somewhere," Ethan replied, trying to reassure both her and himself. "The message said we'd know it when we see it." Chris shifted in his seat, leaning forward. "But what if it's just some elaborate prank? We're in the middle of nowhere for all we know." Jake chuckled, glancing over his shoulder. "If it's a prank, it's a damn good one. Look at us, out here chasing shadows." But the humor in his voice was thin, strained. The further they ventured, the more everyone began to feel the weight of the isolation pressing in on them. The trees seemed closer now, thicker, blocking out what little light remained. The car's engine droned on, but there was a new tension in the air, as if the wilderness itself was watching. A couple of hours later, the atmosphere inside the car had changed. What had started as excitement had now morphed into a heavy silence. The road beneath them was rough, cracked, as though it hadn't been used in years. The scenery outside the windows had become a blur of green and gray, with towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly upwards. Suddenly, without warning, Ethan's phone buzzed in his lap. His heart leapt. Finally, some sort of sign. He lifted the phone, but instead of a new message or directions, the screen flashed erratically before going completely dark. He pressed the buttons, but it remained lifeless. "Signal's gone," Ethan muttered, staring at the dead screen. He tapped it a few more times in vain. "I've lost GPS too," Jake added, his brow furrowed. The navigation screen blinked before shutting off, leaving them with nothing but the empty road ahead. "That's weird. We should at least have something out here." "This is starting to feel wrong," Lisa said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked out the window. "Like we're not supposed to be here." Chris nodded, shifting uneasily in his seat. "Maybe we should turn back. I mean, we've been driving for hours and we haven't seen any signs of life." "No," Ethan said quickly, more firmly than he intended. "We're close. I can feel it." The others exchanged doubtful glances but didn't argue. The air in the car had grown heavy with a kind of anxious expectation. Something was out there, waiting for them. They just didn't know what it was. Minutes later, the car sputtered. Jake cursed under his breath as the engine stuttered, the dashboard flickering. "What now?" Sam muttered, looking up from her phone, which had also gone dark. The car jerked slightly as if it was struggling to keep going. "Relax, probably just the old engine acting up," Jake said, though his knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I'll pull over and check it." He brought the car to a slow stop at the side of the road. The forest around them was eerily still, the only sound the wind rustling through the leaves. As Jake popped the hood and stepped out, Ethan glanced into the shadows lining the road. The trees seemed to press in closer, their trunks twisted and gnarled, roots snaking out like hands reaching toward the car. Jake tinkered under the hood, muttering to himself while the others remained in their seats, staring out at the encroaching darkness. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every passing second, an oppressive weight bearing down on them. "Do you hear that?" Sam whispered suddenly. Everyone froze, ears straining. At first, there was nothing but the wind. But then, just at the edge of hearing, came a faint rustling sound. It moved along the tree line, a soft but unmistakable movement, like footsteps crunching on dried leaves. Ethan's heart began to race as his eyes darted back and forth, searching for the source. "Jake," he called out, his voice tight. "Hurry up." Jake straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's fine, just a loose wire." Before he could finish, a figure darted between the trees, a fleeting shadow, too fast to make out clearly. Sam gasped, clutching the seat. "Did you see that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "I'm not sure what I saw," Chris replied, his eyes wide as he stared into the woods. Jake slammed the hood shut and climbed back into the car, glancing nervously at the darkening forest. "Let's get out of here." The engine sputtered to life again, and the car jerked forward. But the unease in the car had now settled deep into their bones. Shadows flitted in the corners of their vision, quick movements that disappeared the moment they tried to focus. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting. After what felt like hours of driving, the road suddenly widened, revealing a small, overgrown path. There were no more signs of civilization, just an endless stretch of forest. Then, out of the gloom, they saw it. A weathered wooden sign, barely visible in the fading light. The sign was old, the letters faint and chipped, but they could still make out the chilling words carved into the wood. "Welcome to the Forgotten." A heavy silence fell over the group as they stared at the sign, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. "No turning back now," Ethan muttered under his breath, though his voice wavered slightly. The SUV rolled forward, the tires crunching on gravel as they passed the sign and entered the village. Whatever awaited them beyond that point, it was too late to retreat. They had arrived. The village that wasn't there. The car's engine hummed to a halt as they pulled into the center of the village. The place was eerily quiet. Buildings lined the narrow dirt walls, weathered by time, roofs sagging under the weight of years. Yet something was unsettlingly wrong. The houses looked lived in, faint tendrils of smoke curled from chimneys, and windows were open as if inviting a breeze. The air, though still and thick with silence, felt charged with the remnants of lives that should have been there, but weren't. Ethan stepped out first, glancing around cautiously. His eyes moved from one crooked house to the next, noting the eerie stillness that seemed to hum from the village itself. Sam followed reluctantly, arms crossed tightly over her chest as she surveyed their surroundings with a skeptical glare. "This is it?" she asked, disbelief heavy in her voice. "This is the big, mysterious village? It looks like a ghost town." "It's just abandoned," Jake replied, nonchalantly stretching his arms as he climbed out of the car. "Probably hasn't been touched in years. But you've got to admit, the place has a certain vibe." His attempt at lightness fell flat, the unease in his voice betraying his casual tone. Lisa wandered toward one of the homes, eyes narrowing at the details. The front door of the house hung open on creaky hinges, a small breeze causing it to sway slowly back and forth. Inside, she could see a table set for dinner, plates still laid out, utensils neatly arranged, and even a bowl of soup, now cold and congealed, sat as if waiting for its owner to return. "Guys," Lisa called out, gesturing for the others to come closer. "This place isn't as empty as it looks." The group gathered around, peering into the house. There was a strange sense of disturbance. Everything appeared to be frozen in time, yet there were no people. The chairs were pushed back, as though whoever had been sitting at the table had left in a hurry. Clothes were hung out to dry on lines that stretched between homes, and bicycles leaned against walls, their tires dust-covered but intact. "This is insane," Sam muttered, her eyes darting around nervously. "Where are the people? You can't just have a place like this, perfectly intact but with no one here." Ethan stepped further into the village, feeling an odd pull, as though something deep in the air was urging him forward. Every house was the same, quiet, seemingly abandoned, but filled with signs of life that had suddenly ceased. His heart pounded with each step. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "I don't like this place," Chris said, his voice unusually soft as he stayed close to the group. "It's like we're walking into someone's home, but they're not gone, just not here." Jake, on the other hand, rolled his eyes. "Come on, it's probably just a stage thing. Whoever sent the invitation is messing with us. There's no one here because this is all some kind of setup." He kicked at a stone on the path, clearly trying to downplay the growing tension. Sam looked unconvinced, her arms still crossed. "And what about the food left on the tables? Or the fact that this place isn't even on any maps? Tell me how that's part of some setup." Jake shrugged. "Maybe they're trying to make it creepy. It's not working on me." But Ethan wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on a house at the far end of the road, larger than the others and slightly better kept, though its windows were dark. He felt drawn to it, as if something about that house was calling to him specifically. "I'm going to check out that place," he announced abruptly. "You're kidding, right?" Sam said, exasperated. "We've already seen enough. Let's just get out of here." Ethan shook his head. "We can't leave yet. There's more to this village. I can feel it." Lisa, standing near the edge of the street, suddenly froze. She turned slowly, her eyes wide and locked on the tree line beyond the village. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others quieted, straining their ears. At first there was only silence, then a faint whispering, so low it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a soft, unintelligible murmur in a language none of them could understand. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, taking a step closer to Lisa. His face was pale, his expression one of growing fear. "Is that talking?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the whispers grew louder. They were close now, too close, as if circling the group. Sam spun around, eyes scanning the shadows that danced at the edge of the village, but there was no one there. Nothing. Only the oppressive presence of something unseen, something that felt ancient and watching. "Jake, this isn't funny anymore," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Tell me you're not still trying to brush this off as some prank." Before Jake could answer, a dark shape darted past the corner of his vision. He jerked his head to the side, but whatever it had been was gone, lost in the gloom between the houses. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his bravado faltering. "I don't want to see anything," Sam whispered. "We need to go." But the words had barely left her mouth when the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the village once again frozen in eerie stillness. "We should leave," Chris repeated, his voice barely audible. "I don't care what we came here for. This place, it's wrong." Ethan nodded, but something about the village held him in place. He felt the weight of eyes on him, unseen but unmistakable. It wasn't just the whispers or the strange shadows that haunted the corners of his vision. It was the overwhelming sense that they were being watched, hunted even. Without warning, Sam took a step toward the car, determination in her stride. "We're leaving now." But when they turned to follow her, the road they had driven in on was gone. In its place was an impenetrable wall of trees, thick and tangled, stretching far into the distance where there had once been open land. The group froze, staring in disbelief. "The road," Jake whispered. It's gone." "No way," Sam said, pushing past them and running toward the forest. She reached the edge and tried to push through the dense undergrowth, but it was impossible. The trees seemed to close in on her, the branches curling and twisting, almost as if they were alive. "Try going around it," Lisa called, panic rising in her voice. But it was no use. Every path, every side road led to the same inescapable wall of forest. "We're trapped," Chris whispered, horror dawning on his face. "There's no way out." Ethan's heart raced. The village stood silent and unyielding behind them, the forest an impassable barrier in front. There was no sign of the road they had driven in on. It was as if the village had swallowed them whole, removing any means of escape. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "We need to figure out what's going on. There has to be an explanation." But deep down, he knew that whatever force had brought them to this place wasn't about to let them go so easily. They were in the village now, and the village wasn't going to let them leave. Chapter 4, Nightfall. The sun's final rays sank behind the dense trees, casting long shadows across the village. What little light remained quickly dissolved into darkness, and with it, the eerie stillness of the village grew heavier. The once quiet air felt oppressive now, as if it was watching, waiting for something. Each of them could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, like a shroud falling over them. Ethan stood near the car, staring out toward the forest. A cool wind swept through the village, rattling the doors of nearby houses and causing the branches above to sway ominously. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter, though it did little to fend off the growing chill in the air. His friends huddled together a few feet away, their nervous murmurs barely audible. Jake paced back and forth, his frustration palpable. "This is insane, man." His voice cracked as he pointed an accusing finger at Ethan. "You dragged us out here for what? To get us killed in some freaky ghost town? There's nothing here, just empty houses and creepy vibes." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I didn't know it would be like this, okay? It's not my fault. How was I supposed to know the village was like this?" "Like what?" Jake snapped, his face flushed with anger. "Haunted? Cursed? You knew there was something off about this place before we even got here, and now we're stuck, surrounded by..." His words cut off as a low, guttural sound echoed from the forest. The group fell silent, ears straining to catch the sound again. It was distant at first, but unmistakable. A deep, growling noise, almost animalistic, but too distorted to be anything natural. It seemed to come from every direction at once, swirling around them like a predator toying with its prey. Sam's face paled, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" Lisa took a step closer to Ethan, her voice trembling. "It's coming from the woods." They all stood frozen, staring into the dense black forest surrounding the village. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. Then, in the distance, shadowy shapes began to move, flickering in and out of their vision like phantoms. The figures were barely visible, just on the edge of the tree line, but there was something undeniably wrong about them. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved with an unnatural fluidity that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end. "Did you see that?" Chris whispered, his voice a harsh rasp. He pointed a shaking finger toward the shadows. "Something's out there." Ethan squinted, trying to focus. The figures moved quickly, darting between the trees, but never stepping fully into view. His heart hammered in his chest, the rising panic making it hard to think clearly. "Stay close," he warned the others. "Whatever it is, we need to stick together." Suddenly there was a loud crash, a sound of splintering wood coming from one of the houses on the far side of the village. The noise echoed through the streets, bouncing off the walls of the abandoned buildings. Everyone whipped around to face the direction of the sound, their nerves fraying with every second. "What was that?" Sam hissed, clutching at Jake's arm. Jake swallowed hard, his bravado slipping as fear crept into his voice. "I don't know, but it sounded big." Lisa's breathing quickened, her hands shaking visibly. "We need to get inside, now." They rushed toward the nearest house, pushing open the creaky door and stumbling inside. The air inside was musty and stale, the darkness pressing in on them as they huddled together. Ethan fumbled for a flashlight, flicking it on with trembling fingers. The weak beam of light swept across the room, illuminating cobwebs, old furniture, and cracked walls. Outside, the guttural sounds grew louder, closer. The creatures, or whatever they were, had begun circling the village, their growls vibrating through the night air. Every now and then, they could hear the scrape of claws against stone, or the soft rustle of leaves as something moved through the underbrush. The village, once merely unsettling, had transformed into a place of sheer terror. Ethan stood by the window, peeking through the tattered curtains. His breath caught in his throat as he saw one of the shadowy figures emerge from the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs were grotesquely elongated. The creature's skin was as pale as bone, contrasting sharply with the surrounding darkness. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the night, locked onto the house. "Guys," Ethan whispered, barely able to speak. "One of them. It's out there." Jake rushed over, peering out the window. His face went pale and he took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "What the hell is that thing?" Before anyone could answer, Chris, who had been standing near the back of the room, let out a strangled gasp. His face turned ashen and he collapsed to the floor, his body trembling violently. Lisa knelt beside him, panic in her eyes. Chris, what's wrong?" Ethan rushed over, trying to shake him awake, but Chris's eyes were wide, staring into nothing. His lips moved, but no words came out, just shallow, panicked breaths. "He saw something," Lisa whispered, her voice tight with fear. "He saw one of them." Outside, the creature moved closer, its movements unnaturally fast, almost a blur. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched it approach the house. It moved with a deadly purpose, its glowing eyes never leaving the window. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Get away from the window," he shouted, pulling Jake back as the creature closed the distance. They all backed away from the window, huddling together near the center of the room. The air inside the house felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on them. The sounds outside grew louder, more aggressive. The growls, the whispers, the scrape of claws against wood. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the side of the house. The group jumped, their hearts racing as they stared at the wall where the noise had come from. Another thud followed, this one harder, causing the walls to tremble. Whatever was out there was testing the house, searching for a way in. The door rattled on its hinges, and for a moment it seemed like the creature might break through. Ethan held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost worse than the sounds themselves. Lisa clutched Chris's hand, her knuckles white. "Is it gone?" No one answered. They stood frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But nothing came. The village was silent once again, as if the creatures had disappeared into the night. Ethan stepped cautiously toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The creature was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the dread remained, a heavy weight pressing down on all of them. "We can't stay here," Sam whispered, her voice shaky. "We have to find a way out before they come back." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he knew there was no escaping the village. Not now. Not with those things lurking just beyond the shadows. Night had fallen, and with it came the realization that their nightmare was far from over. Chapter 5: The Aswang Hunt. The thick air inside the house pressed down on them, heavy with fear and uncertainty. Every window and door was tightly barricaded, furniture piled high in a desperate attempt to keep the creatures at bay. The flickering light from a single lantern cast long shadows on the cracked walls, making the room feel even more suffocating. Jake sat by the door, gripping a broken table leg as if it were a lifeline. His eyes darted toward every creak and groan of the old house, his paranoia feeding the tense silence that had settled over the group. "We're trapped, aren't we?" he whispered, his voice filled with hopelessness. "They're out there, waiting." Ethan sat across from him, flipping through the old dusty journals he'd found in the back room. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words, notes left by others who had been here before them, drawn into the same twisted nightmare. The faded pages detailed unsettling rituals and stories of strange, shadowy figures that lurked in the village. But what caught his attention the most was a single word that appeared again and again: Aswang. Sam leaned over his shoulder, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. "What is it? What did you find?" Ethan's eyes scanned the worn writing, piecing together the horrifying truth. "They're called Aswang," he muttered, his voice low. "Creatures that thrive on terror, feeding off fear and flesh. These journals, they were written by others who were lured here, just like us." Lisa, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, shuddered. "Others? You mean we're not the first?" Her voice was barely audible, thick with the realization that this place had claimed lives before them. Ethan nodded grimly. "There have been more. These journals, they talk about strange rituals and how the Aswang hunt their prey. They use fear to weaken you before they strike. The more scared we are, the stronger they become." Jake clenched his fists. "So what? We're just supposed to sit here and wait to die? We can't even fight them. What the hell are we supposed to do?" Ethan's grip tightened on the journal as he flipped to a page that outlined a failed escape attempt. His stomach churned as he read the gruesome descriptions of those who had tried to leave the village. "We're not safe in here. These things, these Aswang, they don't just come at you in the night. They're always watching, always waiting. They can get inside our heads, mess with our minds." The group fell silent, the weight of the situation bearing down on them like a suffocating blanket. The house creaked under the pressure of the wind outside, but every small sound felt like a threat. It was clear that they weren't just dealing with physical monsters. They were fighting something far more sinister, a terror that played on their deepest fears. Sam broke the silence, her voice a mixture of determination and fear. "We need weapons. We can't just hide in here and do nothing. If they're going to come for us, we need to be ready to fight back." Ethan glanced around the room, taking in their bleak surroundings. The old house had little to offer in terms of defense. Some rusty tools in the back, a few broken chairs, and a kitchen knife that was more dull than sharp. Still, they had to try. "We'll make do with what we have, but from what I've read, normal weapons won't stop them for long. These things, they're not easy to kill." Jake stood up, his frustration boiling over. "Then what? We just let them pick us off one by one?" "No," Ethan replied firmly. "We fight, but we need to be smart about it. According to these journals, the Aswang can be weakened by salt, by fire, things that disrupt their connection to this place." Lisa nodded, her face set with a grim resolve. "Okay, then we need to find salt, anything that might help. There has to be something in this village." They set to work, scouring the house for anything that could be used to defend themselves. Lisa and Sam found old bags of salt in a dusty cupboard, and they sprinkled it around the doors and windows, creating makeshift barriers. Jake sharpened the table legs into crude stakes, while Ethan tried to fashion a torch using torn fabric and a bottle of oil they found in the kitchen. The night wore on, and the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing hour. Every sound outside, the rustling leaves, the distant growls, made their hearts race. The village, already abandoned and eerie, seemed to be closing in on them, as though the walls themselves were conspiring with the creatures. Just when it seemed they might have a small chance of defending themselves, the guttural noises from the forest returned, louder and more insistent this time. The shadows outside the windows shifted, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. The air grew colder, and with it, the realization that something was coming for them. Suddenly, Chris, who had been sitting silently by the fire, stood up in a daze, his eyes unfocused. His body moved stiffly, as if controlled by an unseen force. "Chris?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling, but he didn't respond. Without warning, Chris staggered toward the door, his movements unnatural, almost puppet-like. Ethan rushed forward to stop him, but before he could reach him, Chris was yanked back by something unseen. His body lifted off the ground as if caught in an invisible grip. His scream echoed through the room as he was dragged out into the night. "Chris!" Lisa screamed, rushing to the door, but Ethan pulled her back just in time, slamming it shut. The group stood frozen, terror-stricken, as the sounds of Chris's screams faded into the distance. Whatever had taken him was gone, at least for now. But the silence that followed was more terrifying than the screams. Lisa collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Sam held her, trying to comfort her even as tears streamed down her own face. Jake, gripping his makeshift weapon, stood staring at the door, his knuckles white with fear. Ethan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. Chris was gone, and now the creatures had claimed their first victim. He didn't know how much longer they could last. The Aswang were playing with them, hunting them one by one, feeding off their terror. "We're next," Jake muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. "We're all next." Ethan glanced at the journals one last time, his stomach churning with dread. They were running out of time, and if they didn't find a way to fight back soon, the village would consume them just as it had consumed so many before them. They were being hunted, and the night was far from over. Chapter 6. No Way Out. The morning came, but the oppressive atmosphere had not lifted. Instead of sunlight breaking through the gloom, the village remained cloaked in a thick, unearthly fog that seemed to cling to their skin. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something darker, something rotten. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hum with the weight of unseen eyes, watching their every move. Ethan stood at the window, his eyes scanning the empty streets outside. He could still hear the echo of Chris's scream, distant yet fresh in his mind. No one had slept. The night had been filled with the eerie sounds of the forest, low guttural growls that seemed to circle the house, growing louder and then fading, as if teasing them. "We need to find him," Lisa said, her voice cracking from exhaustion and grief. She sat huddled by the fireplace, her face streaked with tears. "We can't just leave him out there." Sam was pacing back and forth, running her fingers through her hair in frustration. "Lisa, he's gone," she snapped, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Whatever took him, it's too late." Ethan turned from the window, his face grim. "We can't give up yet. We don't know for sure. We search for him, but we have to stay together. Whatever's out there, it feeds on fear, and it'll pick us off one by one if we split up." Jake stood leaning against the door, his face ashen. "And if we find him? What then? How do we fight something we can't even see?" Ethan didn't have an answer. All he had were the words from the journals, a mix of warnings and half-explained rituals left by others who hadn't made it. He felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him, crushing his hope. They ventured outside as a group, moving cautiously, their eyes darting from the fog-shrouded trees to the empty houses that loomed over them. The village, which had once seemed merely abandoned, now felt entirely wrong, as if it didn't belong to this world. As they moved deeper into the village, signs of Chris's struggle emerged. A trail of broken branches and disturbed dirt led them toward the edge of the village. Blood stained the ground, small droplets at first, but then larger smears, as if something had dragged him across the earth. Lisa gagged at the sight, clutching Sam's arm for support. They stopped in front of a small clearing just beyond the village's edge. There, on the ground, they found one of Chris's torn sleeves, bloodied and caught on a bush. Beyond that, the silence became unnerving. Even the birds had stopped chirping, leaving nothing but the oppressive quiet. "We need to get out of here," Jake muttered, his eyes darting around nervously. "There's no sign of him. He's gone and we're next." "No," Ethan whispered, crouching down to inspect the ground. "There has to be something, a clue, a trail." But even as he said it, the unease in his stomach grew. Something was wrong, more wrong than he could explain. They had been walking for what felt like hours, yet the village seemed to stretch infinitely. The streets twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, as if the space itself was warping around them. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence, a whisper carried on the wind. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The others heard it too, and they turned toward the source. Out of the mist, faint shapes began to emerge, flickering like shadows caught between worlds. Lisa gasped, stepping back. What is that? At first, they thought they were hallucinations, but the figures were too clear, too real. Ghostly apparitions, their faces pale and gaunt, hovered just beyond the mist. They were dressed in clothes from different eras, their eyes hollow, filled with sorrow and pain. The figures didn't speak, but their mouths moved, forming words that echoed in their minds. "Leave, before it's too late." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he called out, but the figures simply floated closer, their forms flickering like dying flames. The group huddled together, the cold chill of the spirit's presence seeping into their bones. They're trapped," Sam whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "These are the victims, the people who were lured here, just like us." One of the spirits drifted forward, its eyes locking onto Ethan. "The Aswang, they cannot be defeated by force. They thrive on despair. You must escape before you become one of us." The words chilled Ethan to his core, but before he could ask more, the figures vanished, leaving the group standing in stunned silence. The realization hit them all at once. The village wasn't just a trap, it was a graveyard, a prison for those who had fallen to the creature's relentless hunger. Lisa trembled, clutching Sam's arm. "We're not going to make it, are we? We're going to end up like them." "No," Sam said firmly, though her voice quivered. "We're getting out of here. We have to stay calm." But calm was a distant memory. Paranoia began creeping in, thick and suffocating. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like an impending attack. Jake's eyes darted between them, suspicion clouding his features. "How do we know none of us have already been taken, changed into one of those things?" "Stop it," Ethan snapped. "That's exactly what they want. They want us to turn on each other." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Lisa eyed Jake nervously, while Sam stayed close to Ethan, her trust beginning to waver. Every glance, every step became a source of tension, a question of loyalty. The village wasn't just haunting them, it was tearing them apart from the inside. By the time they stumbled back to the house, their nerves were frayed. Ethan pored over the journals again, desperate for answers, but they offered little hope. One passage, though, caught his attention, a brief mention of the village's true nature. The village exists beyond the mortal realm, a place between worlds, where time and space twist under the influence of the Aswang. Escape is not through the roads, for the village itself shifts. Ethan's stomach dropped. "We're not in the real world," he murmured. "The village, it's in another dimension." Sam, her face pale, leaned over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" "We didn't just get lost," Ethan explained, his voice tight with fear. "We were pulled here. The village, it's not part of our world anymore. It's a place where the Aswang can hunt without limits, and if we want to leave, we can't just walk out." The group stared at him in stunned silence. Jake, who had been pacing restlessly, stopped in his tracks. "So, what? We're stuck here forever? There's no way out?" "There has to be," Ethan said, though his voice lacked confidence. "But it's not going to be easy. We're dealing with something far beyond what we thought." A heavy silence fell over the group. The knowledge that they were trapped in a realm beyond understanding, hunted by creatures beyond comprehension, sank into their minds like a dark poison. The house felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And outside, in the fog-shrouded streets, the shadows waited, patient and hungry. Chapter 7. The Dark Secret of the Village. The day was darkening again, casting long shadows across the desolate village, and the oppressive fog swirled as if alive, wrapping around the few remaining structures like a suffocating embrace. Inside the house, the atmosphere was strained. The discovery of the village's otherworldly nature had left the group paralyzed by fear, but Ethan couldn't let the crushing weight of despair win. "We need answers," Ethan said quietly, flipping through the journals yet again. His voice barely rose above a whisper, the gloom pressing in on them from all sides. "There has to be something that explains how to stop this." Sam, who had been pacing restlessly, finally stopped beside him. "The spirits told us this place is a prison. We know there's something else at play here, something more than just the Aswang." Lisa sat in a corner, huddled under a thin blanket, shaking her head. "None of this makes sense. Chris is gone. We're trapped in some twisted nightmare. What good will answers do if we can't even survive another night?" "Survival is the only thing we have left," Jake muttered from the doorway. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, flicked suspiciously between Ethan and Sam. He had been growing increasingly erratic since their return from the search for Chris. Now, every word he spoke dripped with paranoia. "We should never have come here. You, Ethan? You're the one who led us to this cursed place." Ethan opened his mouth to defend himself, but Sam stepped forward. "Jake, stop. This isn't his fault. None of us knew what we were walking into." Jake's hand twitched toward his belt, where he had fashioned a makeshift weapon from a piece of broken furniture. "Maybe he didn't know," Jake spat. "Or maybe he did. Maybe he's part of all this." Sam moved closer to Ethan, her face set in determination. "Let's get out of here. Maybe if we explore more of the village, we can find something, anything that might give us an edge." Ethan nodded. "We're not getting anywhere staying in this house." Against their better judgment, Sam and Ethan ventured out into the village, leaving Lisa and Jake behind. As they stepped into the eerie silence outside, the streets seemed even more distorted, the fog thicker, making it difficult to navigate. The village felt less like a physical place and more like a dream or a nightmare, constantly shifting and rearranging itself. They walked for what felt like hours, though it could have been mere minutes. Time didn't work the same way here. Nothing did. And then, out of the mist, they saw something they hadn't noticed before, a large stone altar, hidden behind a crumbling building, its surface covered in strange ancient symbols. It looked far older than anything else in the village. "What the hell is this?" Sam whispered as they approached cautiously. Ethan knelt beside the altar, running his fingers over the rough surface. The symbols were unlike anything he had ever seen, yet they stirred something deep in his memory. Something from the journals. It's old, older than the village itself. Carved into the stone were grotesque figures, their twisted forms locked in some kind of ritualistic dance. Ethan's heart raced as he studied the carvings more closely. They weren't just random markings. They were depicting a story of a pact. "Sam, look at this." Ethan pointed to one particular carving, a group of humans kneeling before monstrous winged creatures. "This is it. This is what cursed the village." Sam squinted at the symbols, her brow furrowing in concentration. "You think these people made some kind of deal?" Ethan nodded. "It matches what we read in the journals. A group of settlers. They must have summoned the Aswang. Maybe they were trying to protect themselves from something, but they didn't realize the cost." Sam stepped back, her face pale. "And now the Aswang are feeding on anyone who comes here. That's the curse." As they stood in the cold, unsettling presence of the altar, Ethan noticed something else. A small, overgrown path leading deeper into the ground. He exchanged a glance with Sam, and they wordlessly decided to follow it. The path descended into darkness, winding like a snake beneath the village itself. The air grew colder, heavier, the further they went. Eventually, they reached the mouth of a cave, its entrance framed by jagged rocks that seemed to close in on them, like the jaws of a beast. Inside, the remnants of ancient rituals lay scattered. Candles long since extinguished, strange relics half buried in the dirt, and the unmistakable smell of decay. The cave was a shrine, a place where the villagers had performed the dark rites that had summoned the Aswang. Ethan could feel it in his bones. This was where it had all begun. Sam knelt beside a pile of tattered scrolls, her fingers trembling as she picked one up. "These symbols are the same as the ones on the altar," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they summoned them." Ethan sifted through the debris, feeling a growing sense of dread. He found a small leather-bound book, its cover worn and brittle. He carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with notes scrawled in a language he couldn't fully understand. But one thing was clear, a warning. "Once the pact was made," Ethan read aloud, "there was no going back. The Aswang cannot be destroyed. They are bound to this place until the last soul has been claimed." Sam stared at him, her face pale. "So there's no way to stop them?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but it seems like the only way to break the curse is to somehow sever the connection between the Aswang and the village." Before they could ponder their next move, a low growl echoed from the darkness behind them. Ethan and Sam froze, their hearts racing as the sound grew closer, more menacing. "We need to go," Sam hissed, grabbing his arm. They hurried out of the cave, but the oppressive feeling only intensified. As they emerged into the village, the fog seemed to thicken, and the air buzzed with an unnatural energy. The Aswang were growing more aggressive, more desperate. The house where Lisa and Jake waited came into view. But something was wrong. The front door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. Ethan's stomach dropped. They rushed inside to find Lisa standing in the center of the room, trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Jake's gone," she whispered, her voice hollow. He just snapped. He kept saying Ethan was one of them, that we were all cursed. Then he ran off into the village. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Jake's paranoia had finally pushed him over the edge, and now, alone in the village, he was easy prey for the Aswang. "We have to find him," Sam said, though her voice was filled with doubt. But before they could react, a sudden crash came from the back of the house. Something was outside, scratching, clawing, trying to get in. The Aswang were no longer lurking in the shadows. They were coming for them. "We have to barricade the doors," Ethan shouted, already grabbing what he could to block the entrance. The others followed suit, frantically piling furniture and debris in front of the windows and doors. But even as they worked, the sense of hopelessness grew. The Aswang were relentless, and no matter how many barricades they built, the creatures would find a way in. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by the sound of glass shattering. They spun around just in time to see a dark, shadowy figure darting through the broken window. It moved with inhuman speed, its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged at them, its form shifting between human and beast. Sam screamed, throwing a chair in its path, but the Aswang barely flinched. Ethan grabbed a makeshift weapon, swinging it wildly at the creature, but it dodged effortlessly. The Aswang was toying with them, savoring their fear. The last thing Ethan saw before the world turned to chaos was the creature's cold, gleaming eyes as it lunged toward them with a hunger that could not be sated. Chapter 8: Betrayal. The atmosphere inside the barricaded house was thick with dread, and the frantic energy of their earlier fight against the Aswang had given way to a chilling silence. Ethan could feel the weight of fear pressing down on everyone. Each member of the group casting furtive glances at one another as if assessing the next threat lurking just beneath the surface. Jake had been increasingly volatile since they returned, the paranoia that had gripped him earlier escalating into something darker. He paced the cramped living room, his hands clenching and unclenching as if he were wrestling with some inner demon. "This is it. We're all going to die in this cursed place," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "And it's your fault, Ethan. What are you talking about?" Ethan snapped, anger flaring up within him. "I didn't force us to come here. We're all in this together." "No, we're not," Jake shouted, his eyes wild. "Some of you are already lost. You can't even see it. You're already turning into them." "Jake, please," Lisa pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper filled with concern. "You're scaring us. We need to stick together. We can't turn on each other." "Maybe that's what they want," Jake hissed, suddenly turning on her. "Maybe that's how they feed on our fear. They're waiting for us to implode, and you're too blind to see it." The tension escalated, an electric charge hanging in the air. Ethan stepped forward, trying to reason with Jake. "We can't let fear control us. We have to find a way out of this." "No," Jake shouted, taking a step back as if Ethan's words were a physical attack. "You're the one leading us to our doom. I don't trust any of you." Before Ethan could respond, Jake's eyes darted to the door, a look of panic washing over his face. "I need to get out of here," he muttered, stepping away from the group. "Jake, don't," Sam called after him, her voice thick with worry. "You can't leave us. You don't know what's out there." But Jake was too far gone in his fear to listen. He made a break for the back door, but Lisa rushed forward, trying to block him. "You can't. You don't understand." In his frenzy, Jake shoved her aside, but in his haste he stumbled, knocking into Ethan. The two collided, and in the chaos, Jake lost his balance, falling into a table stacked with their makeshift weapons. A sharp object pierced the air, and Lisa screamed as she felt the edge of a blade slice across her arm. "Lisa!" Ethan shouted, rushing to her side. Blood oozed from the gash, pooling on the wooden floor. She crumpled to her knees, clutching her wound in shock. I didn't mean to, Jake stammered, his voice cracking with guilt as he turned to Lisa, horror dawning in his eyes. I didn't want to hurt you. I was just trying to escape. Ethan's heart raced, but it was not just the fear of the situation. Something deeper churned within him. As he crouched beside Lisa, he glanced at Jake, who had backed away, eyes wide and breathing heavily. Jake, you need to calm down. This isn't you, Sam implored, her voice shaking with urgency. We're all scared, but we have to stick together. Stick together? Jake's laugh was hollow, tinged with a manic edge. You think that's going to save us? We're already too late. It's too late for me. Can't you see? I've seen things. I can feel it crawling under my skin. Ethan's pulse quickened. Suddenly, the pieces began to click into place. Jake's erratic behavior, his strange outbursts, the way he had been watching them with a mixture of fear and suspicion. No, it can't be, Ethan whispered, realization dawning on him. You've been changed, Jake. You've become one of them. Jake's face contorted in anger, but there was a flicker of something else, fear. No, I'm not like them. You're wrong. He pressed his hands to his head as if trying to fight off some invisible force. You have to believe me. Ethan could see the struggle waging within Jake, the war between his humanity and the Aswang's dark influence. Jake, you have to fight it, he urged, desperation lacing his words. You can't let them take you. But it was too late. The transformation, though subtle, was undeniable. The tension in Jake's posture shifted, his eyes glinting with something other than fear. A predatory glimmer that sent a chill racing down Ethan's spine. Suddenly, Jake's demeanor shifted entirely. The desperation morphed into aggression, and he lunged at them, a snarl escaping his lips. You're all gonna pay for this. Ethan instinctively shoved Sam aside as he raised his weapon to defend himself. Get back! Stay away from us! He shouted, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he braced for the inevitable confrontation. In that instant, the very fabric of their group began to unravel. All the trust they had built was swept away by the tide of betrayal, and in the blink of an eye, their survival was put to the ultimate test. Jake moved with a newfound speed, a dark shadow eclipsing the room as he advanced. Ethan and Sam exchanged a terrified glance, and the unspoken truth hung heavily between them. They were faced with an impossible choice. We can't hurt him, Sam cried out, her voice trembling. He's still in there, but we can't let him get to us. Ethan countered, heart pounding as Jake's growl grew louder, echoing through the confined space. As Jake lunged forward, a flurry of movement consumed the room. The former friend they once trusted was now an enemy, and they had to make a choice. Fight back against someone they once cared for, or risk losing everything. Ethan! Sam screamed as Jake barreled toward them. Teeth bared, eyes glistening with feral rage. In that heartbeat, the room seemed to freeze, the chaos around them blurring into a single point of focus, the struggle for their lives against the darkness that had claimed one of their own. In that moment of terror, it was clear. Their survival hinged on an impossible decision that could seal their fates. Chapter 9. Sacrifice. Panic coursed through Ethan's veins as he glanced at the door, knowing Jake was lurking just outside, transformed into something monstrous. The air felt heavy with dread, each second dragging on as the group huddled together, hearts racing in unison. They were running out of time, and Ethan knew they had to act before it was too late. Listen, we can't keep hiding like this, Ethan urged, his voice urgent yet steady. We have to find a way to break this curse. The journals mentioned a sacrifice, a way to appease the Aswang and end this nightmare. What do you mean, a sacrifice? Sam asked, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. You can't be serious. We're not going to give up anyone. Maybe it has to be me, Ethan said, desperation creeping into his tone. I'm the reason we're trapped here. If I'm the cause of all this, then maybe I'm the one who needs to. No, Sam interjected, her voice rising in defiance. You're not going to throw your life away. We're not going to let them win by sacrificing someone. We have to find another way. The tension between them crackled like static. Ethan felt torn, his thoughts racing. Sam was right, but the weight of responsibility hung over him like a dark cloud. If we don't do something soon, Jake will, he began, but Sam shook her head, cutting him off. Ethan, we can't let fear dictate our actions. The spirits warned us that the Aswang thrive on despair. If we stand together, we can face them. They're powerful, but we have each other, and that has to mean something. Her eyes searched his, pleading for him to see reason. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the heaviness of her words sink in. He nodded slowly, realizing that Sam was right. Sacrificing himself would only deepen their despair. If they were to overcome the Aswang, they needed unity, not division. "Okay," he said finally, determination igniting within him. "We fight together. We'll use what we learned from the journals and the spirits. There must be a way to drive them back." As the reality of their decision settled in, the house trembled with an otherworldly energy. A guttural roar reverberated from outside, shaking the very walls. The Aswang were readying themselves for an all-out assault, and time was running short. "Get ready," Ethan commanded, gathering the remnants of their courage as they armed themselves with whatever they could find: broken furniture, sharpened stakes, and anything that could be used as a weapon. Sam and the others mirrored his resolve, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of imminent danger. Then, the door shattered under the weight of Jake's monstrous form, the creature surging into the room like a whirlwind of darkness. Ethan felt his heart race as Jake's eyes, once familiar and filled with life, now burned with a primal hunger. The air was thick with terror as the friends faced the embodiment of their worst fears. "Stay back," Sam shouted, brandishing a makeshift weapon, her voice quaking yet resolute. "You're not going to take any of us." But Jake, now an extension of the Aswang's will, lunged forward with terrifying speed. They barely had time to react. Ethan and Sam struck out, the sounds of clashing wood and flesh echoing through the room as they fought back against the relentless creature. With every swing, Ethan remembered the ancient texts and the spirit's warnings. They had to draw on the power of unity, to channel their shared strength into a singular force. "We can do this," he shouted, rallying the others as they pushed back against Jake's monstrous form. In the chaos, shadows danced around them, the echoes of past victims manifesting in the room. The spirits whispered encouragement, their presence igniting a spark of hope in Ethan's heart. "We need to focus on the altar," he yelled, recalling the ancient ritual that could bind the Aswang. "We can't let them breach the barriers." The group rallied, pushing back against Jake, who writhed and snarled. The Aswang were relentless, but they had learned their weaknesses from the journals. As they fought, they began to chant words they had found scrawled in the margins, ancient invocations that could turn the tide. But the onslaught intensified. More Aswang poured into the room, their forms twisting and shifting as they lunged at the group with ferocious hunger. "We can't hold them off much longer," one of their friends shouted, panic rising in her voice. Ethan's heart raced as he realized they were losing ground. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, he recalled a crucial passage from the journals. To free the lost, one must be willing to pay the ultimate price. It struck him then, the sacrifice. But the choice was not solely his to make. As the shadows swirled around them, Ethan felt a cold dread settle in his gut. If he were to fulfill the prophecy, he needed to know who among them would be willing to make that sacrifice. In a heartbeat, Ethan found himself faced with an impossible decision. The Aswang were relentless, and the barrier between their world and the real one began to crack under the pressure of their assault. He glanced at his friends, each of them holding their ground, fighting valiantly against the darkness, but the reality set in. One of them might need to be sacrificed to contain the Aswang and end the curse. "Sam," Ethan began, his voice strained. "What if we can't hold them off long enough? What if we need to?" "Stop," she interrupted, her eyes fierce with determination. "We're not sacrificing anyone. We'll find a way to do this together." But in that moment, a terrifying realization washed over him. They had to confront the darkness together. But the threat of the Aswang breaking free into the real world loomed large. They were on the edge of oblivion, and Ethan knew that if they didn't find a way to stop it, their world would be next. As the shadows loomed closer, Ethan found himself in a clash of wills, fighting against the Aswang while battling his own internal turmoil. The choice hung heavy in the air like a blade poised above them, ready to fall at any moment. "Ethan," Sam shouted, snapping him back to reality. "Focus, we need you." In that instant, he saw his friends, not just as comrades in battle, but as family. And as the Aswang closed in, he felt the urgency to protect them burning fiercely in his heart. It was no longer just about breaking the curse. It was about choosing life over death, unity over despair. With a deep breath, Ethan rallied his resolve. "We're going to break this curse together, no matter the cost," he declared, his voice rising above the chaos. "We stand as one." But in the depths of the darkening shadows, the malevolent force of the Aswang stirred, and the horrifying truth remained. One of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice if they were to truly vanquish the darkness. The battle was only beginning, and the price of victory loomed ever closer. Chapter 10. Return to reality. The village was collapsing, the air thick with the sound of crumbling buildings and the distant shrieks of the Aswang. Dust clouded the sky as if the very fabric of the cursed land was being torn apart. Ethan stood at the altar, his breath ragged, as he grappled with the decision that had been weighing on him since they had first arrived. He knew the sacrifice had to be made. But in his heart, something didn't feel right. Was it truly about giving a life? Or was there something more they hadn't uncovered? "Ethan, we don't have time," Sam urged, her voice trembling as the world around them began to disintegrate. The others were scattered, exhausted, some injured from the relentless attacks. All eyes were on him now, waiting for the impossible choice he was about to make. Ethan looked at his friends, each of them scarred by the horrors they had endured. Sam, who had fought tirelessly by his side, was now staring at him with a mixture of desperation and hope. She, like the others, believed that the only way to break the curse was to offer up a life. But deep inside, Ethan felt there was another way. A way that didn't involve spilling blood. He knelt by the altar, hands trembling as he tried to focus. The ancient journals had spoken of sacrifice, but they also mentioned fear, how the Aswang thrived on it, how it gave them power. That's when it hit him, a realization so profound it almost knocked the air out of his lungs. The curse wasn't about physical death. It was about confronting what had been consuming them all along, their deepest fears. Ethan's fear had always been loss. He had carried the weight of his past failures, haunted by the guilt of letting people down, of not being able to save them. And now, that fear had followed him here, into this cursed place. But if the Aswang fed on fear, what if the real sacrifice was to face it head-on, to let go of the guilt and fear that had kept him chained? "Wait," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about dying. It's about facing what we're most afraid of." Sam stared at him, confusion creasing her brow. "What do you mean?" He stood, turning to her and the others. "The journals, everything we've read, it's not just about a blood sacrifice. The curse is tied to our fears. The Aswang use that against us. We have to confront it, or we'll never break free." The ground beneath them shook, as if the village itself was protesting his words. But Ethan pressed on, ignoring the growing instability. "I've been running from my fear of loss. I couldn't save people before, and I've been terrified of losing you, all of you. But if I don't face that, then the curse will never end. I'm willing to confront it. I'll make the sacrifice, but it's not my life I'm giving up. It's the fear." Sam blinked, understanding slowly dawning in her eyes. "You think that's what the Aswang have been feeding on?" He nodded, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "It has to be. It's the only thing that makes sense. They want us to fall apart, to lose hope and give in to despair. But if we stand up to our fears, if we take away the thing that gives them power, we can break this." The others, battered and worn, looked at Ethan with a mixture of doubt and hope. There was no time for debate, no room for error. The village was collapsing around them, and this was their last chance. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Closing his eyes, he centered himself, letting go of the guilt and the fear that had plagued him for so long. He pictured every failure, every moment of doubt, and slowly, he released it. "I'm not afraid anymore," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. "I won't let fear control me." The change was almost instantaneous. The ground, which had been shaking violently, seemed to calm. The oppressive weight that had hung over them lifted slightly. The Aswang, still lurking in the shadows, hesitated as if sensing something had shifted. One by one, the others followed Ethan's lead, each confronting their own fears. Sam, who had always feared being left behind, stood tall, refusing to give in to the dread. Another friend, who had been paralyzed by the fear of death, accepted that it was a part of life. Together, they faced the darkness within themselves. The village, once filled with the cries of the Aswang, felt eerily silent. The creatures, deprived of the fear they had thrived on, began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night. The village itself, the altar, the ancient symbols, all of it started to crumble, disintegrating into nothingness. Ethan opened his eyes, the realization hitting him like a wave. They had done it. The curse was breaking, not through death, but through courage. They had confronted their worst fears, and in doing so, had stripped the Aswang of their power. "Ethan," Sam breathed, looking around in disbelief as the village continued to fade. "You were right." But even as the village crumbled, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite finished. As the world around them dissolved, they found themselves back on the familiar road, the one that had led them to the cursed village in the first place. The night was still, the air crisp and cool, as though nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. They stood there for a moment, disoriented but alive, the nightmare seemingly over. But as they started to walk away, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he pulled it out, frowning as he looked at the screen. A new message had appeared, though he hadn't had reception for hours. He unlocked the phone, his blood turning to ice as he read the words, "The village is gone, but the curse remains. See you soon." He stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. The village had crumbled, but the curse was still alive, waiting, lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan looked up at the others, his face pale. "We may have left the village, but it hasn't left us." Sam's eyes widened as the reality of his words sank in. They had escaped the physical village, but the curse had followed them back, like a shadow that couldn't be outrun. They weren't free, not yet. As they climbed into the car, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of the curse still pressing down on them, waiting for its next move. The road stretched out ahead, dark and endless, and somewhere, out in the distance, the Aswang waited, hungry and patient. The nightmare wasn't over, it had only just begun.